Um, well, let us see. My name is Mike Thomsen. I'm a writer. I got my start sort of professionally writing about video games in 2007, working as an associate editor for IGN. This specifically the subscription side, which was called IGN Insider at that point. And I moved to New York in 2009 and became a freelance writer and did that for, I guess, 7 or 8 years. And now I currently have a job as an editor at Condé Nast, and I continue to write freelance, and I'm working on a book about mixed martial arts. And I guess, for me, and, this would probably be the first question I have for you is like, someone that's been writing about games for a long time is I'm especially interested in kind of aging as a game writer now is, because, when I got attracted to writing about games and, I started doing it in 2006, was like not professionally, but just sort of like, because I wanted to work out like my own thoughts about it. And, I had all these ideas and nowhere to put them. I was very conscious of there being a generational divide. And, I was sort of like on the positive end of that, or the young end of that, I guess you could say. But, I remember looking back at these, these older writers that have been doing it since the 90s and early 2000s. And, I appreciated a lot of them, but I felt very strongly that there was a lot that they were leaving out. And so that was a huge motivating factor for me. And, like 10 years on, I'm thinking about that sort of like both in terms of what the ultimate, effect or impact or, role, my own work or the work of my cohort, which I think I would include you in, what our generation has done. What's the worth of it? What's the value of it? Where has it led? So, I mean, do you think about that?
Well, thinking about it now, I mean, as I heard you say that, I think it's like, I wonder if we ever go past that initial thing that brought us to it. Like you said that you felt like you were working stuff out. And I mean, do you feel like you have? Not to just flip the first question back on you, but like I feel like for me, there were specific things that drew me to doing this, but I thought no one enters a labor intensive elective project thinking they're going to do it indefinitely. Right. I figured, I'll be done after a year. All my questions will be answered. Right. And instead, it's been this thing where I had created a space for myself to sort of just indulge questions I had that I felt like I couldn't explore elsewhere. And so, in that regard, like I feel like I haven't gone past that initial instinct. Maybe the scope has expanded, but I'm still just like, okay, what else do I not know? What else do I not know? I mean, do you feel like you reached a point as you went on where you were like, okay, I figured this out, I don't think about it anymore, I've moved on?
No, not really. I just like,
do you think that's weird? Do you think that's weird? I mean, is that like just a life thing, a games thing, an us thing, or is it just what it means to be a writer?
I mean, I think part of it's historical. Like, it's just like a byproduct of writing for a relatively new sort of creative form, that the starting point, even kind of 30 some years into the history of video games, like when I was, starting in like 2006, it was still like dealing with some kind of fundamental, like large questions that, I would say people had kind of gotten over in, film criticism or book criticism, fiction criticism, like all these other forms. They'd, and it's not like the subjects weren't relevant, but the questions had specified in a way that, at least in my experience, like they hadn't really been specified yet. So we're still asking like, how are games art? I know people get sidetracked into whether or not they are, but I think, the real spirit of that question is a confusion about how, like, what is the art in video games compared to the art in movies or whatever. And I think that's still like a valid question, but I don't think it needs to be asked as generally as maybe, a lot of people were asking it, myself included, 10 years ago. Yeah. And I think, the internet is also just so much more ubiquitous now that, I'm starting out as a writer and I'd never wanted to be an essayist. I started out writing movies and working in the movie industry. And I kind of just, I remember in college, I very specifically did not want to be a journalist. Like the idea of reporting seemed really depressing to me.
I don't know if we've talked about this, but we overlap in that regard too. I did everything in my power to avoid going down that path.
Yeah, and so I just kind of stumbled my way into this at a relatively late age, but I was a 30-year-old novice as far as essay writing and reporting and journalism goes, and there wasn't a lot of mentorship. There wasn't a lot of guidance. Yeah. There's a lot of opinions, but most of those opinions weren't especially valid. And I think most of our cohort, definitely at IGN, I think around all the major game sites, we're pretty inexperienced also. They didn't necessarily have the backing, or I don't know, the confidence or experience to really sort of, be good editors, be sort of good stewards of inexperienced writers. So you would get instead this sort of fraternal guidance about here's how you navigate the PR channels and here's how you go through E3 and these sorts of generalized kind of, social rituals, but you wouldn't really get a no, here's how you write a line. Here's how you start an essay and here's how you, don't do this. At the level of, the actual writing and reporting and here's what's in the public interest and here's what isn't, and but just to finish the thought, I don't want to ramble on, but
that's okay.
I had all this curiosity, but it was very hard, in the absence of ubiquitous Twitter feeds from PhD students and a lot of people that were at the time deeply committed to the field of games criticism or game study. It was kind of harder to find that material. Whereas now there's a huge variety of readily accessible sort of games criticism from a lot of different spectrums, or a lot of different points of view.
I think there's been a number of 180s, and it's not no one's writing a history book. I think this is an experiential shared history that you and I, I know what you mean when you referred to a cohort, but you and I have never met. We've spoken before, and I don't even know who else would be in our graduating class. I'm sure I may know some of them, probably not most of them. I probably wouldn't know many of them. But it's just funny because I think our cohort, we were the generation where there was a lot of similar itchiness and insecurity. Do you remember? Do you call yourself a games journalist? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I feel like that's melted and dissipated, and it's done what a lot of other things in games have done, which is this sort of, just slamming down on the accelerator in the other direction. Yeah. Whether it's false confidence or something else, that seems to be, the image that's being presented is no, we are experts. We shouldn't have to, feel, I don't know, any self-consciousness,
Yeah, I still think the sort of the public interest question is open. I think that
as far as what?
What the public interest of games reporting is. Yeah. I think the criticism question has kind of been settled to me, but what's the public interest in reporting what kind of processor PS5 is going to have 14 months before it comes out and 8 months before Sony announces it.
Right.
I think that's a serious real question that game journalists haven't answered yet. There is no good argument for the public interest of a story like that, even if it comes at the risk of one person's job. If like one person on an assembly line in China gets fired for, being sourced as the leak for, a story on like Kotaku or Eurogamer, the public interest of, a consumer base knowing that it's going to be an Intel i7 whatever is not worth one person losing their job over, at least as far as like the consumer side. But like the criticism side, I think, we've caught up as far as like what the public value of games criticism is, what the public value of a game review is, separate from the consumerist question. It's just sort of, it's the same as, reading a movie review at this point, and that's a huge kind of spectrum. It's like, and I think, we've built up, not necessarily you or I, but like people interested in games have built up a significant kind of spectrum of different styles of criticism at this point, from like super academic to the sort of like personality driven,
super experiential
profiles.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you say, or you started off talking about just sort of the tradition that you feel like we're continuing on with. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people on the developer side who worked on Atari games who don't feel like they're part of any sort of lineage. Only they're only, other than like they acknowledge like, well, things picked up from there. But I feel the same. I've heard a similar sort of, I don't know, it's almost like a wistful regret from writers who had their careers cut short, or and the thing is, it's the same types of things that happens in our generation, or is happening, or has happened with our generation. It's just that we didn't necessarily realize when we went through the revolving door that we were pushing someone else out. And so I wonder if about a lot of these questions that you or I may have, if we would have fewer of them, if there was a more concrete feeling of tradition rather than sort of a one that we similarly recognize we're picking up on in retrospect.
Well, yeah, that's sort of what I've been getting at in my own like thinking about this. And like, I totally, part of what got me thinking about this is, I look around at everyone who I considered sort of a peer or maybe someone I looked up to when I started. They're all gone. Like,
when you say that, you mean they're not journalism anymore, or they're not writing about games anymore?
All of the above. Like,
I assumed you didn't mean they were all dead.
Almost everyone I worked with at IGN has either stopped writing about games or has, there's like two people, like Greg Miller is doing Kind of Funny,
right?
Which is, a very different thing from what he was doing at IGN, even though maybe the persona is sort of consistent. I think the sort of position is very different. And like Damon Hatfield is still there, but like, my old editor at Insider has long gone. He's, he hasn't been on the game journalist, game media side in 6 years. I think, 6 years. He went over to marketing. One of the other editors that started at the same time as me, I felt like we were both kind of freshmen at IGN. We're kind of the young, sort of vulnerable, inexperienced kind of deer who could barely stand on her own 2 feet. He does PR now. Like people I looked up to, like Lee Alexander, basically stopped writing about games. Bonnie Ruberg, who I used to love reading, and we used to be fairly social back in San Francisco. She's gone on to academia, and she does great work still. She's still focused on games, but like just this sort of like Xanadu of like, games media as like the GameSpot, IGN, 1UP, Polygon, like Kill Screen, like whatever, this fantasy that there was somehow a commons that, everyone was sort of like contributing to. It's still there, but like, it ages out very quickly. And I wonder if that's tied to, why, this ongoing uncertainty about what the public interest is in games journalism as a form.
Yeah.
You know, kind of in the same, like the industry of publishers, of publications, of websites that need this influx of, you know, eager new journalists to grapple with these same questions. That preys in a sense on innocence, that, you know, people that are willing to take these sort of old sawhorse questions seriously in a way that, you know, people who have been around for a long time maybe get tired of. In the same way that, you know, I mean, like at my most exhausting, you know, when I was starting out, like the stuff I was writing, you know, a lot of people were just like, you know, bored to tears by it. They're like, why are you doing this again? Like another round of this kind of essay, another round of these sorts of who cares?
Yeah.
Like, where were you in 99 when we were all arguing about this, or 2003, or like, so it just, you know, seems like, you know, just a long sequence of waves crashing against the shore, but the shoreline never really seems to advance. It just sort of like the composition of the waves change, but we're always kind of like pushing at that same limitation.
It's I don't know if this is, I doubt this will come as a shock to you. Yesterday I interviewed Henry Jenkins, the media theorist.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And he has in the last decade moved on to looking specifically at comics and the use of pop culture iconography in the civic imagination. So just like the use of pop culture in like protest imagery. He had told me, you know, we reached a point in our interview where he was like, you know, this is Henry speaking. He said, you know, I in part put down, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what I'm remembering from yesterday, paraphrasing, is part of why he put video games down as a professional focus was it sort of reached this point 10 years ago where he realized that a lot of the questions I was asking him were things he was wondering about 10 years ago, and it just seemed like they were at an impasse. And a lot of the questions, I don't know, I think we may have talked more specifically, you know, when I interviewed you about your experiences as a writer, but as time has gone on with this project, what I realized the bigger focus of it is just sort of the weird way video games are mainstream but are not mainstream. And I don't know that there are answers to those questions. I don't know. I do know that what we have seen in games, the sort of leaning back on, you know, revenues or personalities, that doesn't seem to cross that barrier, that bridge that you mentioned earlier about the, you know, those types of questions. But I don't even know, like, I don't know how many people are wondering those types of questions, and I don't know if I should just be so discouraged to hear from, you know, someone who's fairly knowledgeable in all of pop culture that, you know, if he felt, oh, gee, this isn't going to go anywhere, I'm going to move on somewhere else. Like, I don't know if there's a lesson I should take from that. I'm not really doubting anything. Momentum is what it is, and I've done more than 200 of these, so I will continue.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know, because it seems like the place that you have rested is, you know, you still write occasionally about games, and I'm sure you still think about them. I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you feel out of place doing that? Or do you feel like that's a healthier, better balance?
I don't know. Like, you never really get in balance with anything, I don't think. I definitely notice it's a relief in a lot of ways to not have to just, like, you get in this cycle, you know, especially, you know, when it's a full-time job. And, you know, you come in every morning and it's just the empty kind of blog roll that you have to populate. You have to fill this up with 10 stories or find a way to just funnel words into this sluice that people are going to devour. Like, you constantly kind of have to hurl your own emotions at things that you're not, you know, not sure you would otherwise do to, you know, create kind of a spectacle. Like, all right, well, let me go play God of War now. Like, I don't actually think I want to play God of War. I don't think it's actually interesting. And there's, you know, a ton of other stuff I'd rather be playing. You know? But, you know, I guess that's the new thing. I guess that's the newsworthy thing. So let me kind of open my own, like, thought process, my own feelings up to this new kind of external presence and try and like, turn the whatever synthesis comes out of that collision into a, content, into a story,
right,
into, a cluster of thoughts that have some degree of coherence and are additive in some way to what people have already done on, the subject of action games or the God of War series up to, and at a certain point you just, it's exhausting because, you're just running into your own limitations over and over again. So, and that's, that's why I think it's like the entire industry in a way is set up to be hostile towards any kind of like personal growth or development for writers. And like, it's one of the things that, it kind of depresses me looking at a lot of new people coming up because I've sort of like been in the same position, like the sort of optimism and excitement to get a staff job somewhere.
Right.
You just see all these exciting young writers that had been doing it, for no pay or for very little money, and they get staff writing jobs at places and, their voice disappears or they just start churning out, Kotaku stories that might as well not have bylines on them. They're just like, and, it's not because they don't have talent or, initiative or anything. It's sort of just like the format itself prevents like any, anything other than games journalism coming out. So like, I guess to me, I'm at a point where I think the games criticism is in a really good place, but games journalism now I think is in a really troublesome place. Like games journalism now is probably at a, is roughly the equivalent of where video game reviews on IGN or GameSpot were in 2003. Like there's that level of like crudeness to them and that level of kind of,
right,
there's more enthusiasm than thoughtfulness. And, it's self-limiting in a very bizarre kind of way. And I think that, I think it's sort of like a business model that it is that way.
I don't know that I've ever interviewed, I don't know how many journalist interviews I've done, but I don't know that I've ever spoken to anyone who covers games as a fan second and a journalist first. And I'm not necessarily including us in that, but I think, a very common thing I've heard is, I'll ask, what interested you in covering games? And, without missing a beat immediately, I hear shouted into my ear, I get free games,
right.
Which is fine and understandable. But I mean, sort of where I've fallen down with this project, not fallen down, but sort of the position I've understood where I've been coming from is if you do want to report on the realities of production or the people, there are some very real world limitations that come in. I mean, I know you just had the experience. Was that last year where you flew overseas and you did a whole story like that? I mean, did you run into a lot of like PR headaches or obstacles you had to jump through? Like I would be fascinated to hear like what that was like versus covering a Western company.
That was actually, it was really difficult to just deal with the trip. Like getting a journalist visa to China is exceedingly difficult.
Yeah.
But like the company that I was profiling was pretty cooperative.
It seemed like it, yeah.
And I think a big part of that was just because, like very few people had really covered them or taken the subject all that seriously. Or when it was, taken seriously, it was like in a short trade story for like Gamasutra or gamesindustry.biz or something.
Right.
And it was done on a scale that, guaranteed that it would always be kind of like marginal. It wouldn't, it would just be like a short little color piece that was clearly kind of desk research. No one went to China. And there were a couple pieces that had been written about them at like outsourcing publications or like business to business publications where someone did go to China, but it was usually like a, or the person didn't go to China, but it was like a local correspondent, like based in Shanghai. And those were just kind of like, fluffy kind of, here's a exciting new company that's, in a growth sector. And here's the colorful story of the president or whatever. But there were, there's very little effort to put everything together. And like, I don't know everything. Like, I worry sometimes that I sound like, like some condescending prick when I talk about all this. It's like a lot of this just comes from,
you're fine. Yeah.
For me, not like, these are questions I don't know the answer to that I want to know the answer to. Like how does this all fit together? So it's like, I wanted to know more, and I'd written a bit about outsourcing in the past, and I was curious about how it fit into the whole industry and the way the industry is developed. And like, when you start developing structural questions about the industry that aren't just about, like, I don't know, like, is Destiny a bad game because their compiler was slow and like the creative director was fired, or like, is there's, something bigger happening? Like, I mean, I still find like, I harp about this a little bit. I've gotten kind of fixated on it in the last year, but like, a lot of the financial reporting about what's going on in the games industry is all sort of like superlatives. It's like the Switch is Nintendo's fastest selling console.
Right.
It's outselling Wii. PS5 is Sony's fastest selling console of all time. Like Xbox One has sold 30 million, install base. So like Far Cry 5 is the best selling Far Cry game of all time. God of War 5, or whatever. God of War breaks all the sales records. And he's like, wow, this is a real golden age. Things seem to have like never been better. But then if you just, if you compare the numbers generationally, you're like, wow, I guess, Sony's selling well, but like the console market itself is actually doing worse. There are fewer consoles selling at this point in this generation than there were at the same point last generation. Like 3.5 years in, fewer consoles have been sold, in this PS4, Xbox One cycle than had been sold in the 360 PS3 cycle, and fewer games are being released, dramatically, like fewer games, at least, console games.
I just put my my notebook away earlier today because I did that interview yesterday, which had notes for it. But I brought it with me when I went over to Kuwait, and I talked to this guy who's a developer in India, and he was giving me a breakdown on figures I hadn't heard, which was just sort of comparing the population to the population over there to how many PlayStation 4 owners there are, and it was. You hear those figures, you really wouldn't believe that these consoles are amazingly successful. I mean, it was like a negligible percentage of people owned a PS4. I mean, I don't want to make up numbers, but it was memorable.
Yeah, like it's super tiny, and like and like you don't necessarily have to make a value judgment about that.
No,
but it's a qualitative, it's a quantitative just fact. It's like.
Yeah,
the console industry is in a slump right now. It's not just in a recession. It's in a depressed state. It hasn't grown for several years. But when you sort of cannibalize it along these sort of very fanish kinds of categories, like how is Sony doing? Well, Sony's doing great. Like they don't put out as many first-party games as they did last generation.
Right.
And there are fewer major third-party games from places like EA and Activision, but Sony's doing amazing. They're selling more consoles than have ever been sold before, and they have this like free subscription service where you get a free game every month, and like they're making money off of their online service now, and like, but at the same time, fewer games are coming out. Publishers aren't making more money. That's interesting. Like EA makes a fifth the number of games that they were making in 2010, 2011.
Right.
and they make the same amount of money. It's still billions of dollars. But so, from a consumer point of view, if you want to like play games, now you have a fifth the number of choices if you want to play like a big console sort of major publisher kind of game that, a lot of people have been conditioned to expect. There's a dramatic reduction in supply of those. And, it's creating, I think, a real like cultural tension that's spilling over into a lot of ways. And you read all these stories about like how the industry is doing amazing, and like, people are getting these massive budgets to make these, spectacular looking games. And it feels like something is askew. And, meanwhile, like the industry as a whole is huge, but it feels like there's a whole chunk of the industry that's just not paying attention to the other side of it, where
it's getting bigger, but it's getting flatter.
Yeah, and everyone plays games now, but like very few people give a shit about games journalism. And I think that's sort of clarifying in a way that, I think maybe it's a much more specific demographic than we think. And, there's probably a much bigger overlap with the sort of like the, masculine sort of aggressive, disgruntled sort of rationalist group that sort of fed into Gamergate. It was like, I think there's a much closer association to that and, the culture that was sort of brewing at IGN and GameSpot and 1UP in the mid 2000s. And, maybe some people want to admit, and yeah, it's, I think there's a bigger picture here. And I think it's frustrating to see that a lot of people on the journalist side of things are not necessarily, I don't know. I don't want that to sound like an accusation, but it's just sort of like, you're I myself am curious. Like I feel like I'm in a lot of these communities, and like, I know it's how difficult it is to like report on games. It was like the last time I was at E3, I was like, basically escorted out of almost every booth I was in for, not aggressively, but I was just like, well,
Is that because you write or have written negative reviews in the past, or is there some other reason that you feel you're a unsavory character there?
I mean, it wasn't
because I've run into stuff like that, where you start having problems, getting games on time for deadline and all those types of things. It's not a coincidence.
I was welcomed into the booths. It's not like they were like, oh, get him out, but it was just, be like, all right, well, I'm here to cover what you're showing, and I think the one I was able to do was about Disney Infinity, and like I wanted to find out why there were 8 studios working on one single game for Disney. And it's sort of a trade junket, so like they're mostly, I think, expecting to deal with kind of enthusiast people that just want to play the demo and talk about whether it was fun or not. And then they have Best Buy buyers and GameStop buyers. And
I was going to say that's the other jockeying. It's almost like the press aspect to E3. I mean, look at where E3 is now, where it's open to all of the public now, which is not a judgment, but it shows you how much of an afterthought sort of it's like media is there so long as it helps promote, which. I don't know. I mean, I think like if you are interested in doing more than that as a writer, as a journalist, you quickly hit a wall. Yeah. And I wonder if like what we're talking about is like, it's funny because as experiential as many game reviews may be, there's still this sort of connective tissue that's not explored. I mean, this other thing you were talking about with. The tradition we continue on. And I mean, I had interviewed, I may mispronounce his name, but Per Schneider. Is that right?
Yeah. Per.
I had interviewed him, and, I got to talking just sort of, again, not not making an accusation, just sort of, did he feel to any degree like IGN sort of helped forge the gamer identity that, down the road sort of precipitated into attitudes that precipitated Gamergate? And I mean, I don't know, because obviously I'm not expecting an answer that's going to be like, yeah, we are to blame. I mean, I feel like my function with this project is because I'm not really, because this is sort of like my main output, when it comes to game stuff. It may change down the road, but because I don't have any sort of association with any other site or whatever, I'm not going to worry about burning any potential bridges or whatever. So I feel like these are questions that are interesting and worth asking. But if I recall, I mean, sort of his answer was, quote unquote, those people may read our site, but they don't hang out there. And I feel like that's almost sort of, I'm not calling him naive, but I feel like that's sort of a naive thing where there is it's funny because we want to see how big games are, but no one really wants to take ownership for, warts and all, what this thing is. So it's like we want it to have a lot of depth, but we don't want to examine it. Or you'll run into things with reviews where people don't like your opinion because there's this attitude of, well, fuck this guy. Games have enough, whatever it is. They have enough. They've accomplished enough. They don't need to do more. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. You know what I mean?
No, I mean, having come from IGN, I think that that's 100% what we were doing. I think, the entire concept of the consumerist press, directly fed into Gamergate, and, not exclusively, right? Like, Gamergate was sort of tied to these, decades old sort of social fissures that, maybe in the naive period of like the early internet in the 90s and 2000s, like people assumed we had more in common with one another than we actually did, when like all you wanted to do was find out what score Mario Kart Double Dash got, or like what the new Mario on DS was going to look like. But I mean, a huge part of the rhetoric that, we were building and enforcing at that time, and, I mean, this is part of why I wanted to get into it, to try and like push against this in a way, was kind of catering to this idea that games were separate and special. And, it was like, why people were so hostile for so long to the comparison to movies. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, I got, in a lot of cases, some justifiable, crap for the Citizen Kane sort of comparisons with Metroid Prime. And, I was still just sort of like shocked that, like, the question itself was taboo, even though it was like milquetoast. And, there was a real intense hostility that games are their own thing. And, they shouldn't cross over with anything else. They don't, they exist in their own sort of special sphere, and they don't have to be comparable to movies or books or anything else. They can just be games. And on the one hand, that's sort of like, you can understand where people are coming from when they say that. But on the other hand, it's not true. Like, games are not special. They're not like, they don't exist in their own separate sphere. Like, they exist in a world that has precedents for all sorts of stuff. And, they come out of that world, and, the desire to see them as these sort of like, I don't know, immaculate conceptions that just emerged out of arcades, or, Ralph Baer's lab.
Right.
And like, there was no time before. It was just like this big bang. And then we had video games. Like, I don't know. Like, I just, I disliked that notion. And then, when you see people, really becoming militant in enforcing that, a few years later, and then really starting to attack people and really do, actual damage, because, they felt kind of deputized, by creating this rhetoric that games were special and separate. We kind of created the territory. We carved out this territory that then, this group this the subset of the audience felt kind of like deputized to go defend, and in some cases defend like really aggressively and violently, especially when people sort of began, in much better ways than I had, challenging the fundaments of that specialness and separateness. That was one of the fundamental things Anita Sarkeesian did. It was like, she kind of forced video games back into a sort of critical tradition, with a really sort of like straightforward form of feminism that's,
right,
old and like not especially like novel. And, just nothing really controversial about what she was saying. Like, people refused the association, and then it just started, these factional lines were drawn, and people felt really justified in drawing those factional lines, especially like on the game fandom side, in a really disturbing way. And I don't think that, anyone working in games media should really, feel super comfortable about detaching themselves from the culture that created that. Even though part of why I got into games media was to push against stuff like that, to try and sort of like rejoin games to the rest of the world, to kind of place them back on Earth instead of this special kind of matrixy vacuum that they seem to hover in. I don't really think I succeeded at that at all. Or at least it was sort of like pretty easily overrun by the sort of momentum of history.
I mean, this may sound weird, and I may be putting my foot in my mouth. I might be wrong. It seems like, where things have gone, and I think it's even a nebulous concept to talk about game culture, at least the parts of game culture that manifest online, which is a weird concept to just sit and think about because it's not real. Right. It's surreal. It seems like where the friction is now, where the war is now, is over who is the bigger victim and who has claim to be a victim. Do you feel that's accurate? And I don't think it's just in games, but I think it's also in games.
No, I think most of that sort of like competitive victim discourse is trolling, it's trollery, and
I don't even mean like between two camps. I just mean it's like a general way of relating.
I don't know. Things are definitely more hostile now, and I think that it's just the terms of disengagement have shifted.
I have noticed that. Yeah. So you think we're more disengaged, or we're just disengaged from each other in a different way?
We're just disengaged, I think, in different way. Like the disengagements are now it's back to being like class and social resentment instead of like Sony or Nintendo. There was a lot of hostility. There's always been hostility in games media, and between the audience and writers. It's just been people would accuse you of being a Sony fanboy instead of a feminist 15 years ago, and that would be the biggest sort of like scarlet letter on your career. Like, oh, don't listen to him, he's an Xbox fanboy. Like, why would they assign an Xbox fanboy a Sony review? And that came directly out of having these different like siloed kind of websites, the IGN like Xbox channel and the PlayStation channel, and I'm the PlayStation editor. It was a direct function of how the community structured itself at the sort of level of the publishers. And, the audience sort of like developed, the values according to how the publishers sort of trained them to, expect. They sort of internalized the values the publishers wanted them to have. Mm-hmm. That was most expedient to, the publishers making money off of, cutting themselves up according to those sorts of platforms. And now, there is no PlayStation editor at IGN anymore. It's just, it's games editors and movie editors and TV editors. And so now those sort of resentments have, they just reformulated themselves as more general kind of social antagonisms instead of, medium specific antagonisms. Like, I'm a role-playing fan and I'm a sports fan. I only play Madden. You only play, Drakengard or whatever it is. And now it's like, I'm a classical liberal and you're a feminist and I'm an anarchist and,
I mean, maybe it was a naive. I don't know that I had like a mission statement when I started doing this thing, but I do realize maybe it was a naive goal. But I mean, of course, I wanted to continue to illuminate my own ignorances and blind spots, just as far as like how people in other camps see the world of video games, including people outside of video games. I sort of had a hope that I would help seed more compassion, like at a starting point, it was asking a lot of people in AAA, what is it you feel the audience for games doesn't understand about what goes into making it, and I don't know. I mean, further down the road, I freed myself of feeling responsible for there needing to be, that output, and just trusting that just putting the stuff out there, it will, and it has pinged back to me in different ways where people have been appreciative of it. But I mean, I do think, I don't know, I think you already touched on this before, but this was definitely one of the things I had learned as well over the years, is something you had said about just how innately aggressive media is and how hostile people tend to take it just for existing. And I think games is a similar thing. It's a form of media. I don't know if more compassion is possible or necessary. I think just what I find disheartening is how someone buying a $60 game seems to obscure curiosity about chains of exploitation, or even just having a curiosity. Because I maybe that's a generational thing, but I growing up how I grew up, not just consuming, not just only doing games. Like, I was naturally curious. I was the dorky kid who noticed when a certain writer wrote a certain episode of The Simpsons, and I don't even think. I mean, I didn't have internet when I was a kid. So I don't know. I don't know if I had, if I would have zigged instead of zagging, but it still sort of surprises me how games are still siloed in that way when it comes to talking about sort of the people behind them. And so it was kind of interesting to watch games sort of write out, a series of scandals about the tech industry, and now they're writing out a series of scandals about Hollywood or show business or entertainment, and that's rippled out into a lot of different other industries. But it just seems to be this thing where somehow that narrative of games are all about the player that has not been able to be challenged. And I've had developers not even complain, but just observe that it's interesting and odd that people who play games are more famous than the people who make them. I don't even know that the streamers and such are household names, but certainly they are more well known than I don't even know, because you can't even really credit one individual to with one game. which has been another, that's been a generational thing too that I know has irritated people in games. But I don't know. I don't really have a question here. I'm just this is sort of a thing that like I'm still trying to figure out, and I wonder, and maybe there is no solution. I think I'm just surprised, because I would think, and that's sort of what Henry Jenkins was talking to me about yesterday, was sort of, the advent of the showrunner as a media phenomenon that changed a lot of things in TV. But I think we're skipping a generation in games because I don't hear names from a younger generation. I still hear Will Wright. I still hear Peter Molyneux. I still hear maybe Miyamoto. But I think, sometimes I'll hear Carmack. Those are the only names they know. And I don't know that there has been a new generation of names to even
that's
spark that kind of interest. Yeah.
And that's sort of like what drives me nuts about like game journalism. Like the reporting, in a sense, is my, everything I've found out in trying to sort of figure that out is that, those people don't really exist anymore because you have 8 studios working on Disney Infinity, or you have, 5 studios working on the next Call of Duty, and that's not counting the outsourcing company. Like, there's, there's 30 some different companies that worked on Horizon Zero Dawn, and it's, there's like a handful of American studios or Western studios that get kind of the top billing, but like we're way past the point where there are individual game designers anymore, at least at the sort of console level. You can have still, you can have things like Gorogoa and, these smaller games, and like Nina Freeman still makes, games. There still are people that do these smaller scale things, but like, at the level of, consoles and major publishers, like, Cory Barlog didn't make God of War. Like, he had very little to do with that game in the scope of things. And I mean, in a way, this is sort of like just becoming kind of very similar to film, because like, having come from the film industry, like, I've probably said this anecdote elsewhere, but like, like the director is one of the most overhyped positions on a film set. They can be very important people. If you go work on a Kubrick movie, like Kubrick controlled everything. A Soderbergh set, Soderbergh shoots, does his own like cinematography and, works very closely with actors. But, you go on to another set and like the director is at like a vanity position, and the actual movie is made in collaboration between the camera department and the first assistant director, and the location manager. Like, it's primarily a bureaucratic thing that comes out of the collaboration between these different departments, kind of in the same way that like, Raven works on the multiplayer or the zombie mode of Call of Duty, and then Infinity Ward does a story level, and then, Beanox and a couple other studios will work on maps for the multiplayer. And then, all of them will be supported by, 20 different outsourcing companies for animation, environmental objects, level design, all that sort of like support stuff, asset creation, network testing. And then it all gets sort of like stitched together. And then, at E3, like Mark Lamia will come out on stage, or, David Vonderhaar, whoever. Like, and there'll be like one person that like the fans can sort of associate with, but it like, no one made Disney Infinity. Like, no one made Destiny. Like, no one makes, no one is making Black Ops 4. Like, it's so many people. It's like, who makes Reddit? Like any like individual game. Like they've become something other than games at this point. Like, no one made Fortnite. Like, who, there's no Will Wright of Fortnite. There's no Miyamoto of PUBG. There's no Miyamoto of like League of Legends. These things are like business platforms now. They're not creative works. Yeah. And that doesn't automatically have to be bad, but I think it's characteristic of where we are now. And I sometimes feel like, still being curious about, games and how the industry works and how that's reflected in, the actual experience of playing these games. Like, it's frustrating that, there isn't more to find out in games media about like these sorts of things. They're still just sort of like evaluated as, is it fun or not? Does it work or does it not work? And then did the studio have to crunch or not? Because crunch is bad. And like if the studio had to crunch, then we can all just pile on the studio for having a bad work culture.
Right.
And if they didn't crunch, then, okay, that's fine. I guess it's good then. Like, like Dark Souls, the remaster just came out again. Everyone loves that game. Everyone's so like enthralled by that game. But I guarantee you that, the crunch on that game was like enormous. Like I'm sure the working conditions at From Software, especially with the financial constraints they've had throughout the company history, and specifically the ones they had before Dark Souls came out, before it was actually a hit. They just had this sort of like small kind of, I don't want to say cult hit with Demon Souls, but like, it did much better in the West than anyone thought. And, they decided to gamble on expanding it as a multi-platform game. But, they still had real financial limits on that. I promise you people, were tortured to get the original game out.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of like, well, David Cage is an asshole because, he created a hostile work environment at Quantic Dream, which is 100% true.
Right.
But it's like, I'm sure, like, Naughty Dog, Naughty Dog is notorious for burning people out for,